Okay, so our story this morning begins with another journey, not Moana's, but a journey to the Isle of Friesland. Friesland is a small, kind of rectangular-shaped island in the northern Atlantic Ocean. It sits between Iceland to the north and Norway to the east, and has towns with festive-sounding names like Forlanda and Sorand, Bondania and Beinar. In order to get to Friesland from here in Needham, we'll have to travel almost 3,000 miles across the ocean, and that, it turns out, will be very difficult. And it won't be difficult because transatlantic plane flights are long and expensive, although they certainly are. And it won't be difficult because I haven't given any of you any advance notice to pack your bags, although that's also true. Getting to Friesland will be very, very difficult because there are no plane flights there, nor are there any cruises or ferries or submarines that we can take. Actually, there's no way for us to travel to Friesland because Friesland, it turns out, is not real. So, Friesland may be a made-up island, but to European explorers in the 16th century, Friesland was a very real place. It all began with this Venetian man named Niccolò Zeno, who in 1558 drew a map of Friesland in his book Della Scoprimento, a book which narrated his family's travels across the sea. In this book, Niccolò claimed that his distant ancestors had discovered an island called Friesland all the way back in the 1380s. What led Niccolò to invent a fake island out of nothing but pencil and his imagination? He was probably motivated to promote his family's legacy. At the time Niccolò was alive, it was common for Europeans to draw maps to help cement the power of empire. But even if the desire to celebrate his family's legacy was there, to write himself into the history books, the question still remains: who would believe Niccolò? Who would think that he was telling the truth about this far, far away island? Who would be foolish enough to buy into his fantasy? The answer, it turns out, is a lot of people. After Niccolò drew his map in 1558, a map that became known as the Zeno map, other cartographers started drawing Friesland into their maps, too. For centuries after the Zeno map was first published, other European explorers declared in their travel logs that they too had seen Friesland on their journeys across the Atlantic. Perhaps the most high-profile moment in the history of this particular fake island occurred in 1580 when Englishman John Dee, an advisor to Queen Elizabeth, went so far as to claim Friesland as English territory. Niccolò's map seemed so familiar, so believable, that he actually managed to draw an island into being. While we often think of maps as describing the world around us, Niccolò's forgery shows us how maps also create the world around us, transforming what we see and also what we believe to be true. Now, I don't know about you, but most of the time these days, I don't spend much time looking at large, colorful parchment maps like Niccolò's from the 16th century. The map that is the most common companion in my daily life is provided to me by the seemingly inescapable power of Google. Does anyone else out here use Google Maps? Yes? Okay, a lot of us. Now, I use Google Maps to get around almost everywhere here, including to church this very morning. Particularly in Boston, the city where one wrong turn in a car can send you a full 20 minutes out of your way down a series of frustratingly windy one-way streets, Google Maps can start to feel almost as essential as Dunkin' Donuts coffee. It's so integrated into my own daily life that I don't really notice how much I rely on it until my phone unexpectedly runs out of battery and I find myself in a waking nightmare, stranded in the parking lot of the IKEA in Stoughton, trunk loaded down with heavy boxes of ready-to-assemble bookshelves, completely uncertain of how to get home. While it may seem that Google has cornered the market on 21st century map making, there are so many different maps that help us navigate the world around us. Sometimes they're electronic, and other times they're printed on paper or drawn, sometimes three-dimensional globes that spin in satisfying circles. Some maps, like Google's, show us the names and locations of specific streets and highways, but many others tell us other things about the world, like the topographic maps that tell us the heights of mountain ranges and the location of river systems, or the colorful transit maps published by the MBTA that show us all the different ways the lines of the T intersect one another, or thematic maps that show us weather patterns and voting districts. As you can see, maps tell us a lot more than just how to get home from IKEA. They teach us how to interact with places and move through space. Maps tell us about the value of our culture and the place that we live in. In this way, they teach us not only about where we are in the world, but also about who we are in it, offering a kind of fundamental orientation, helping us feel just a little less lost at sea. We humans crave these maps to provide a sense of order and meaning in our otherwise sometimes unpredictable and messy worlds. My own dependence on maps came into particularly stark relief for me last summer when I had the opportunity to travel to Mexico City. This vibrant, pulsating megacity reminded me constantly of how little I really know about the world. Suddenly, daily tasks of walking from one place to the next became an epic feat of wayfinding, trying to figure out how to cross busy streets without getting hit by cars, accidentally getting off at the wrong subway stop, asking friendly strangers for directions in Spanish. Disculpe, ¿dónde estoy? Excuse me, where am I? My sense of not knowing was far more than spatial, though. It was social and cultural and historical. I found myself constantly stunned by my own lack of understanding. How was it possible, I wondered to myself, that I had never really learned about the place that is the heart of Mexican government and economy, the city that is physically larger than Los Angeles and higher in population than New York City? My own map of North America had been so centered upon the United States that I had missed it. One afternoon in Mexico City, while riding in a taxi back to my hotel, I was having a conversation with my taxi driver about the immigration crisis on the US-Mexico border. I mentioned something about the American Southwest, intending to refer to the region that contains Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and other states. And my taxi driver interrupted me urgently. No, he exclaimed. Esto no se llaman América Suroeste. Esta región se llaman el norte. We don't call this region the American Southwest. We call this region the North, the northern part of Mexico. What he meant was that the region I have been taught all my life to call the American Southwest is, in fact, geographically and in many ways socially and culturally contiguous, inherently linked with much of what I consider to be northern Mexico. In fact, prior to the Mexican-American War of 1848, all of this land and more belonged to Mexico. Fully 1/3 of the territory that we consider today to be part of the United States, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, Nevada, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, all of this was actually Mexico. And all of this area continues to be deeply connected to Mexico, depending on who you ask. The Mexican people I spoke with did not refer to what happened in 1848 as the Mexican-American War, like I, as a US American, was taught to do in my history textbooks in grade school. Instead, the Mexican people I spoke with called it La Invasión Norteamericana, the North American invasion, one chapter of a long history of US empire building. In her book, Borderlands La Frontera, Gloria Anzaldúa writes piercingly of this experience in the borderlands of Texas and Mexico. She famously proclaimed, "The US-Mexico border es una herida abierta, an open wound, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. Borders are set up to define places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderland is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. An unnatural boundary, Anzaldúa reminds us. These days, we're so overwhelmed by images and talk on the evening news depicting a line drawn between the US and Mexico that it can be easy to forget that it is, in fact, a human-made division. Although we may associate the US-Mexico border with the Rio Grande or Sonoran Desert, there is a crucial difference between them. National borders never occur naturally like mountains and rivers do. National borders are not neutral environmental formations. I didn't cross the border crossed me, goes the Mexican-American rallying cry. The lines zigzagging across our political maps tell stories of human hunger for power, stories of us and them, stories of who belongs and who does not. And they are forged by nothing more or less than human violence and fear. I don't mean to suggest that borders aren't somehow deeply real. As we know from the near constant news about the US-Mexico border these days, borders that humans created and unnatural though they may be, nonetheless have a direct and powerful impact on the lives of all of us, but particularly the lives of the people and communities that span both sides of the border. And yet we know from history that borders are not fixed or static. The political maps that define how we see the world can and do change all the time. That sometimes it's not enough for us to look at the same singular map over and over again. That sometimes we must erase old maps that we know so well and start all over again, redrawing something different. I was reminded of the importance of redrawing our maps when, on a sweltering afternoon this past August, I stumbled into the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City. I wandered into a special exhibit called Territorios de la Memoria, Territories of Memory, and found myself face to face with a giant piece of fabric hanging down from the center of the room. The artwork was by an Argentinian artist living in Mexico named Irene Dubrovsky, and at first it was hard for me to tell what her piece was about. When you got very, very close to the fabric, you could begin to make out these delicate black pen lines crisscrossing one another in what seemed to be a series of squiggles. Then I saw in one corner of the piece the words, peligros de la ruta, dangers of the route, secuestros, kidnappings, reclutamientos forzados, forced recruitments, altas temperaturas del desierto, high temperatures of the desert, heladas, freezing, crimen organizado, organized crime, la ruta del diablo, the route of the devil, deportaciones, deportations. Upon a closer look of those black pen lines, the central image of the piece became clearer. It was different routes of migration between Mexico and the United States, and the lines intersected to actually form the outlines of the faces of migrants themselves. The migrant routes on this map were also the silhouettes of people. In the very bottom corner of the piece, Dubrovsky wrote in fine black marker, Ruta del Migrantes, migrant routes, Google Maps. Google Maps on your phone will not tell you the truth about the dangers of crossing the Sonoran Desert. Useful though it may be in certain moments, this electronic map falls terribly short of communicating the complex realities of moving through the space in this part of the world. Sometimes, as Dubrovsky shows us through her artwork, we need to fundamentally redraw what we think it is we know. Sometimes we need to try to make things that seem familiar to us unfamiliar again, so that we might deepen our understanding of the way that other people experience the world. Maps, in and of themselves, are not inherently bad. Orientation and direction can be extremely helpful for us when we are trying to understand complex human rights crises, and just when we're trying to get to church on Sunday mornings. But it can become far too easy for us to get so attached to one set of directions one way of understanding the world, that we start to believe that it is, in fact, the only way. So how do we begin to review and maybe even redraw the maps that shape our own lives? The good news is we don't need to be artists, nor cartographers, nor do we need to travel thousands of miles to a foreign country. Allowing ourselves to redraw our own maps is a creative process that starts from within, one that begins from a place of questioning and curiosity and openness. Maybe it begins with a public library, with diving into books and newspapers and movies that tell histories from the perspectives of peoples who are not from the same country, race, class, or gender as we are. Maybe it begins with a simple question: is there another way of traveling from my home to my work each day? Are there neighborhoods nearby that I don't even know about because I never take the bus that runs through them? Who are the people who I do not meet because the maps I use do not bring me into relationship with them? Friends, this process of shifting the way we understand who and where we are in the world can be overwhelming at times. And it's also exhilarating because it opens up for us all kinds of new possibilities, new options, not only for seeing the world, but for being ourselves in it. Making the familiar unfamiliar again means that we have a chance to reevaluate, a chance to make different choices if we feel moved to do so. Making the familiar unfamiliar again means that we have a chance to connect with other people better, by appreciating the multitude of ways there are to be human in this world. There are so many gifts on this journey of exploration, gifts that stem from the question, what are the edges of my own understanding, and am I willing to travel to those edges and stare out in wonder at the breathtaking mystery of all I do not yet know? May our time together this morning in this faith community inspire us all to enter into that journey of new understanding together. May it help break us open to possibilities for ourselves and our community that we cannot even yet imagine. And may it help us grow into the loving people, neighbors, and church that we are called to be. May it be so. Amen.